Hello, everyone. Have you ever looked in the mirror and wondered just how much of who you are comes from your parents? I mean, really thought about it. The way your eyes crinkle when you laugh, that stubborn lock of hair that never stays in place, or even that subtle, unexplainable fear of deep water. We inherit so much, not just in our DNA, but in the stories and secrets we're born into. But what if the person you thought you were, the story you were told, was a lie? A deep, cavernous lie that had been carefully constructed to protect you, or perhaps to hide something far more sinister. This is a story about a man named Leo Sterling, 35 years old, a respectable architect in a quiet suburb of Boston. He had a great life, the kind you see in movies and think, yeah, that's what a good life looks like. A loving wife, Sarah, and 2 kids who adored him. A big, beautiful house with a porch swing, a dog named Barnaby, and a classic American dream. He thought he knew everything important about himself. His mother, Eleanor, a kind, gentle woman who ran a local bookstore, and his father, Richard, a stoic but loving man who taught history at the high school. Richard wasn't his biological father, but Leo never saw it that way. Richard was Dad, plain and simple. The man who taught him how to fix a leaky faucet, the man who stayed up late helping him with his algebra homework, and the man who, on his 18th birthday, sat him down for a serious talk. That's when he learned the truth about his beginnings. It wasn't a dramatic, tear-filled confession. It was calm, almost clinical. Richard and Eleanor had been high school sweethearts. They got married young, but after years of trying, they couldn't have children. Then, one day, Eleanor came to Richard with a confession that would change their lives forever. While working a summer job in a neighboring town, she had been involved with a man. It was brief, she said, a moment of weakness, fueled by the feeling of hopelessness about their own fertility issues. She was pregnant. Richard, being the man he was, chose love over everything. He adopted Leo as his own, gave him his name, and never once made him feel like he was anything less than his son. They told Leo this story to protect him, to let him know he was wanted, loved, and a part of their family, no matter what. The biological father? He was a traveling musician, they said, a fleeting ghost who was never heard from again. For years, that was enough. The story was a part of who Leo was, a quiet footnote in his otherwise perfect life. He had a few questions, of course. Was the man a good person? Did he ever think about me? But those questions were abstract, like asking about a character in a book. His real family was right in front of him. Richard and Eleanor, Sarah, and the kids. Life went on. The first crack in that perfect facade appeared a few months ago, on an ordinary Tuesday. Leo was at his desk, sketching out some new designs, when his phone buzzed with an email. It was from his mother, Eleanor. A single, cryptic line, "We need to talk about your father." The email signature was unusual, too. Not her usual "Love, Mom," but simply Eleanor. It was a small thing, but it sent a shiver down his spine. He called her immediately. No answer. He tried again. Nothing. He drove to her bookstore, his heart pounding in his chest. The store was closed. The lights were off. A note on the door said, "Closed for personal matters." He tried her house next. Again, no one home. It was like they had vanished. A few hours later, his father, Richard, finally called him back. His voice was strained, distant. He told Leo that Eleanor had received a letter and it had deeply upset her. She had gone to stay with her sister in another state for a few days to clear her head. Richard's voice was tight with a kind of fear Leo had never heard before. He told Leo not to worry, that everything would be fine, but the words felt hollow. The man who had been the unshakable rock of Leo's life was trembling, and it was terrifying. The following week, Leo found the letter. It wasn't on purpose. He was at his parents' house, watering their plants while they were away, and he found it tucked under a stack of magazines on the kitchen counter. It wasn't addressed to his mother, but to his father. The envelope was old, yellowed, and had no return address. The handwriting was jagged, aggressive, almost like a threat. He knew he shouldn't open it. He knew it was a violation of his parents' privacy. But the unease he felt was a physical weight in his stomach, a deep, gnawing curiosity that he couldn't ignore. He tore it open. The letter was short, but every word was a hammer blow to the life he knew. It wasn't from a traveling musician. It was from a man who knew things only a father would know. Details about his birth, a small birthmark on his hip, the name his mother had secretly planned to give him before Richard intervened. But the most terrifying part was the signature. A name Leo had heard before, but never in a context that had anything to do with him. Marcus Thorne. The name was like a gunshot. It was a name that had been in the news for decades. A name associated with some of the most brutal bank robberies, violent heists, and a string of unsolved murders that had terrorized the East Coast in the 80s. Marcus Thorne wasn't a traveling musician. He was a ghost, a myth, a legend of the criminal underworld who had disappeared without a trace after his last, bloody job. Everyone believed he was dead. But this letter, this terrifying, undeniable piece of paper, proved otherwise. It was a simple, chilling message. I'm back. I want to see my son. Leo's world didn't just crack. It shattered. The man he had always believed to be his real father was, in fact, a monster, a real-life boogeyman, and he wanted to be a part of Leo's life. The story about the traveling musician was a lie, a beautiful, necessary lie that had kept this monster at bay. But now it was clear that the lie had run its course. His life, his family, his safe little world, all of it was in danger. He had to figure out what was happening, what this man wanted, and why he was coming back now. And the only people who could tell him were his parents, who had vanished into thin air, leaving him alone with this terrifying truth. The first few days were a blur. Leo couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. The letter was a physical presence in his pocket, a burning coal he couldn't put down. The weight of his parents' secret, and the true identity of his biological father, was crushing him. He looked at his own hands, his children's faces, and wondered if there was a single ounce of Marcus Thorne in any of them. The man was a criminal, a monster. What did that make him? He felt a new, terrifying layer of guilt he didn't even know was possible. Every time his son, 10-year-old Finn, got into a minor scuffle at school, a cold fear would grip him. Is this it? Is this the darkness from my blood showing itself? He spent hours on the computer, deep diving into old news articles and police reports about Marcus Thorne. The stories were horrifying. The ghost of the Northeast, they called him. A brilliant, meticulous planner who was always 2 steps ahead of the law. His crew would hit banks, warehouses, and armored cars, and they were known for their brutality. The last job, the one that made him disappear, was a jewelry store heist that left 3 people dead, including a young security guard. The trail went cold after that. No one knew if he was dead or alive, but the general consensus was that he'd either been killed by a rival crew or was lying low somewhere, living off his ill-gotten gains. The thought of this man, this ghost from a violent past, wanting to meet him now felt less like a family reunion and more like a predator stalking its prey. Leo finally got a call from his mother. Her voice was thin, shaky. She was still at her sister's, and she wanted to know if he'd talked to Richard. He didn't tell her about the letter. He couldn't. Not yet. He just told her he was worried about them and wanted to understand what was going on. Eleanor's response was a series of vague, evasive non-answers. It's complicated, honey. We'll tell you everything when we get home. But he knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that they weren't going to tell him. They were going to try and bury the secret again, to protect him from a truth that was already staring him in the face. His wife, Sarah, noticed the change in him. The sleepless nights, the distant stares. She was a practical, no-nonsense woman, and she knew something was deeply wrong. He couldn't bring himself to tell her either. How do you tell the person you love that your biological father is a notorious, violent criminal who just reappeared after decades? The secret felt like a toxin poisoning his marriage. He began pushing her away, creating a chasm between them, all to protect her from a truth he didn't even understand himself. The first real break came in the form of a small, discreet package that was left on his doorstep one morning. There was no return address, just his name scrawled in that same aggressive handwriting from the letter. Inside, wrapped in a faded handkerchief, was a small, antique silver locket. It was tarnished and old, but inside were two tiny photos. One was of his mother, Eleanor, looking impossibly young and beautiful, her smile bright and innocent. The other was of a man Leo had never seen before. He had a harsh, angular face, piercing dark eyes, and a confident, almost arrogant smirk. It was a face that could belong to a dashing hero or a terrifying villain. And now Leo knew it was the face of Marcus Thorne. The package contained more than just the locket. Tucked underneath it was a small piece of paper with an address and a date. A rundown, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, Friday at midnight. A meeting with Marcus Thorne. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over Leo. Fear, of course. The man was a killer. The meeting could be a trap. But there was also a raw, irresistible curiosity. He needed answers. Why now? Why him? What did this man want? And deep down, in a place he was ashamed to admit existed, there was a flicker of something else. A primal, unspoken need to understand the man whose blood ran in his veins. He knew he couldn't go alone. He couldn't go at all, really. The rational part of his brain was screaming at him to throw the note away, to call the police, to run as far as he could. But the emotional part, the part that was tied to his very identity, was compelling him forward. So he did the only thing he could think of. He drove to his parents' house, convinced that if he just waited, they would return, and everything would make sense. When he arrived, the house was just as he had left it, but something was different. A strange car was parked down the street, an old, beat-up sedan. The front door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open slowly, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. The house was silent. He walked through the living room, the kitchen. Everything was exactly where it should be, except for one thing. On the dining room table, a single chair was pulled out, as if someone had just left. On the chair was a small, brown leather satchel. He unzipped it. Inside was a stack of carefully organized files, folders, and notebooks. It was a life's work, a meticulous history of every single one of Marcus Thorne's crimes. Dates, locations, names of victims, and a stunning collection of handwritten journals that seemed to detail Thorne's thoughts, feelings, and motivations. There was also a single sealed envelope on top. He knew instinctively that it was for him. He opened it, his hands shaking. The letter was from his father, Richard. It wasn't a long letter, but it was filled with a desperate, heartbreaking honesty. Richard confessed that he and Eleanor had known for years that Thorne was still alive. He had been sending them letters, not threats, but pleas. He wanted to be a part of Leo's life. He was dying, he said, and he wanted to make amends. Richard had spent the last 2 decades meticulously tracking Thorne, gathering information, and trying to find a way to make him disappear for good, to protect his son. The letters they had received weren't from Thorne, but from a lawyer acting on his behalf. The last letter, the one that had sent Eleanor into hiding, was different. It wasn't a plea. It was a demand. Thorne had somehow found out about a specific, small detail in Leo's life. Something so personal, so private, that it could only have been told to him by someone close to Leo. Thorne had been watching him. A terrifying realization. The letter was a simple ultimatum. Meet him or your family will suffer. Richard's letter ended with a heartbreaking apology. He was going after Thorne himself, to confront him one last time and ensure his son's safety. He had packed his things, left Eleanor with her sister, and was going to the meeting in Leo's place. But the address on the note from Thorne was different from the one in Richard's letter. There were 2 different meeting points, 2 different traps. Leo's head began to spin. Which one was the real meeting? And which one was a decoy? And where was his father, Richard, going? He had to find him. He had to stop him. He had to face this truth, this ghost of a biological father, himself. The story was no longer just about a man's past. It was about a future that was closing in on him. A deadly game of cat and mouse he had been born into without even knowing it. The adrenaline was a live wire, coursing through Leo's veins. He was no longer just a spectator in his own life, a man whose existence was built on a lie. He was a player, a son, a man fighting for his family. The sheer terror of the situation was finally eclipsed by a cold, desperate resolve. Richard had gone to save him, to confront a monster who was, by all accounts, still a living, breathing menace. Leo couldn't let him do it alone. The two addresses were burned into his mind: the abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, and a small, nondescript apartment building downtown that Richard had mentioned in his letter. Which one was real? He had to make a choice, and he had to make it now. He reread his father's letter, his eyes scanning every word, every phrase, searching for a clue. Richard was meticulous, a history teacher who valued facts and evidence above all else. He wouldn't have gone to a meeting without a plan. He had to have left a breadcrumb trail. Leo looked at the file satchel again, the meticulous records of Marcus Thorne's crimes. Dates, locations, names. Then, a tiny detail jumped out at him. A few of the older files had been paper-clipped together, a deliberate grouping. They all related to a series of heists that took place in a small coastal town called Harborwood. In Richard's letter, he mentioned a private investigator he'd been working with, a man named Miller. Miller, Richard wrote, had found a crucial link in Harborwood that tied Thorne's past to his present. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead he had. Leo grabbed his car keys and drove, his heart pounding in time with the engine. He called the police, but he couldn't tell them the whole story. "My father might be in trouble," he said, giving them the two addresses and a vague description of Richard's car. He knew it was a long shot, that they'd likely arrive too late, if at all. This was on him. This was his burden to carry. As he drove, his mind raced back to his childhood, to the countless times Richard had protected him. A bully at school, a bad grade, a broken arm from falling off his bike. Richard had always been there, a steady, unwavering presence. Now Leo was the one who had to protect him. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He was going to save the man who had raised him from the man who had biologically created him. Harborwood was a sleepy fishing town, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. He found the address from the old files, a dilapidated seaside motel called the Salty Anchor. It looked like it hadn't seen a guest in decades. The paint was peeling, the sign was crooked, and the windows were boarded up. He saw no sign of his father's car, no sign of life at all. He got out and walked around to the back, and that's when he saw it. A single, fresh tire track in the wet sand, leading away from the motel and toward the old, rocky pier. He followed the tracks, the fog rolling in from the ocean, making everything feel eerie and surreal. The pier was old and creaky, the wood splintered and gray. At the end of it, a small, weathered fishing boat was tied up, its engine idling. And there, on the boat, were two figures. One was his father, Richard, his back to Leo, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The other was a man Leo instantly recognized from the locket: Marcus Thorne. Thorne wasn't the boogeyman from the headlines, not anymore. He was an old man, his face weathered and creased, his hair thin and gray. But his eyes, those dark, piercing eyes, still held the same cold, calculating intensity. He was talking to Richard, his voice low and calm, almost conversational. "You spent your whole life protecting him," Thorne said, a hint of respect in his tone. "That's admirable. But it's over now. He's my blood, and he has a choice to make." Richard turned and saw Leo. His face was a mask of shock, followed by a raw, guttural fear. "Leo, go back. Don't do this," he yelled. Thorne just smiled, a thin, cruel smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Too late, Richard. He's here now. My son. The boy I never got to raise." He turned to Leo, his gaze intense, a strange mixture of possessiveness and pride. "I'm not the man they write about in the papers, Leo. I'm a dying man. I have a legacy to leave behind. A life's work. I want you to have it. I want you to understand who you are." Leo couldn't speak. The air was thick with the weight of the moment. He looked at the two men, the two fathers. One, the man who had loved him, protected him, and raised him. The other, a monster, a criminal who was offering him a twisted, bloody inheritance. Thorne pulled a small, worn notebook from his pocket and held it out. "This is the location of everything," he said. The last of the money, the connections, everything. Take it. It's yours. Leo looked at the notebook, then at his father, Richard, who was pleading with his eyes for him to walk away. The choice was agonizing. He could take the money, disappear, and start a new life. He could turn Thorne in and finally put this ghost to rest. Or he could walk away, leaving his father to face this monster alone. But then, Thorne's eyes landed on Richard, and a flicker of something changed. The calm veneer cracked, replaced by a deep, seething resentment. "You took my life?" Thorne snarled, his voice losing its calm facade. "You took my woman, my son, my future. You think you can just walk away from that? No. One of us is going to walk away from this, Richard. And it's not going to be you." He pulled a small, pearl-handled pistol from his waistband. It was old, a vintage piece, but it was real. Leo's blood ran cold. This wasn't a reunion. It was a confrontation, a deadly climax that had been building for decades, and he was right in the middle of it. The gun wasn't pointed at Leo. It was pointed at Richard, the man who had been a father to him for 35 years, the man who had given up everything to keep him safe. The choice was no longer about a legacy. It was about life and death. The silence was a physical thing, pressing down on them on that foggy, desolate pier. Leo was frozen, his mind a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. The man who was his father, the man who had always been there, was now staring down the barrel of a pistol held by a man he'd only known existed for a few weeks. The two fathers, a living embodiment of the war raging within Leo himself. Thorne's finger was on the trigger, his face a mask of cold, vengeful fury. "Say goodbye, Richard," he snarled. But before he could pull the trigger, something happened. A voice, clear and sharp, cut through the tense air. "Don't you dare." It was Eleanor, Leo's mother. She emerged from the thick fog, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a fierce, protective fire. She was holding a small, rusty crowbar she must have found in the motel. She wasn't a hero, a fighter. She was a gentle, book-loving woman. But at that moment, she was a mother protecting her family, and there was nothing on earth more powerful. "It was all a lie, Marcus," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "You weren't a traveling musician, but you weren't this ghost they write about either. Not then. You were a good man, a scared boy who made some bad choices. But you never came back for me. You never came back for your son. You chose this life. You chose to be a monster. So don't you dare come back now and try to claim him." Thorne's face crumpled, the mask of a hardened criminal falling away to reveal a broken, tormented man. "You don't understand, Eleanor," he said, his voice a desperate plea. "I did it for you, for him, to give you a better life. I had to disappear. It was the only way." "The only way?" she shot back, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "The only way was to abandon us? To leave him without a father?" Richard was the one who was there. He was the one who stepped up. "You're not his father, Marcus. You're just a man who's too late." Leo watched this tragic, heartbreaking confrontation unfold, the truth pouring out like a dam breaking. The full weight of his parents' sacrifice hit him. The years of living with this secret, the fear, the lies they told to protect him from a ghost who wasn't just a monster but a man who had also been wronged, in his own way. He looked at Richard, his father, who was still trying to shield him even in the face of death. He looked at his mother, Eleanor, who was ready to fight for them all with a simple crowbar. And he looked at Marcus Thorne, the man who was both a legend and a tragedy. In a moment of pure, instinctive rage, Leo lunged forward, grabbing the pistol from Thorne's hand. He didn't know what he was doing. He wasn't a fighter. He was an architect. But he couldn't stand by and watch his family get torn apart. Thorne, weakened by age and a lifetime of regret, didn't fight back. He just watched, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and relief. The sound of sirens, faint at first, then growing louder, echoed through the fog. The police. They had come after all. The warehouse and the apartment building were decoys, a way to throw off anyone who was following them. Richard had left the trail to Harborwood knowing that if Leo was smart enough to figure it out, he would know where to find them. The police swarmed the pier, their flashlights cutting through the mist. They found an old, dying man with a gun in his hand, a legendary criminal finally brought to justice, not by a daring shootout, but by a family he had tried to claim and failed. As they took Thorne away, he looked back at Leo. Their eyes met for a long, silent moment. Thorne didn't say a word. He didn't need to. In that look, Leo saw a lifetime of pain, regret, and a strange, twisted love for a son he never knew. He saw the potential for a monster and a man. And in that moment, for the first time, Leo understood the true complexity of his own identity. The end of the story wasn't a grand, cinematic conclusion. There were no happy endings in a situation like this. Richard was okay, shaken but unharmed. Eleanor was a mess of tears and relief. The family was reunited, but the secret was out, a wound that would take a long time to heal. Leo went home, to his beautiful house and his loving wife and children. He looked in the mirror, and for the first time, he saw not just the eyes that crinkled like his mother's, or the stubborn lock of hair that came from his father, Richard. He saw himself, a man who was a part of a much bigger, more complex, and more tragic story than he had ever imagined. He was the product of love and betrayal, of sacrifice and crime. And he was a testament to the fact that blood doesn't define a family. Love does. And that's where the story ends for now. A man who found out his biological father was a famous criminal, and in doing so, found the truth about himself, his family, and the power of the love that held it all together. Before you go, if this story resonated with you, if it made you think, and if it kept you on the edge of your seat, please consider giving this video a like. Your support means the world to us. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss another story that will challenge the way you see the world. Thank you for watching.